Throughout history, there have been leaders who ruled with an iron fist, leaving behind a legacy of brutality, fear, and widespread suffering. These rulers didn't merely seek power, they sought total control, often at the expense of their people. The top 5 most brutal dictators in history, in order of most gruesome, represent a dark chapter in human existence, where absolute power didn't just corrupt, it obliterated lives. Let's delve into the chilling stories of these tyrants. Number 5. Few figures in modern history have presided over as much devastation as Joseph Stalin. His reign over the Soviet Union, beginning in the mid-1920s and continuing until he died in 1953, was one of terror, purges, and brutal repression. The Great Purge of the 1930s, where Stalin targeted perceived enemies of the state, was marked by mass arrests, show trials, and public executions. Intellectuals, military leaders, and even close allies were labeled as enemies of the people and faced death or years of torture in the Gulag. He even targeted his own family, sending his son Yakov to a brutal prison camp and ignoring his pleas for release. Yet the purges were only the beginning of the horrors Stalin unleashed. The Holodomor, a man-made famine in Ukraine from 1932 to 1933, was one of his most heinous crimes. Stalin's policies of forced collectivization led to widespread starvation, and those who tried to flee or steal even a handful of grain were shot. Estimates suggest up to 7 million Ukrainians died. Stalin's rule was absolute and unforgiving. Millions perished, and even those who survived lived in constant fear of a knock on the door in the dead of night. Number 4. Adolf Hitler's name is synonymous with evil. His Nazi regime, which ruled over Germany from 1933 to 1945, was responsible for one of the darkest and most brutal genocides in human history. Hitler's rise to power was fueled by a toxic ideology based on Aryan supremacy and the belief that Jews, Romani people, the disabled, and other groups were inferior. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly to solidify his control, employing a brutal secret police force, the Gestapo, to eliminate political opponents and dissenters. In 1939, Hitler launched the invasion of Poland, triggering World War II, a conflict that would engulf the globe and cost over 70 million lives. But the war was not just about territorial expansion. For Hitler, it was also an opportunity to enact his final solution, the extermination of Europe's Jewish population. Hitler's brutality extended to other groups as well. His regime persecuted and killed homosexuals, Slavic peoples, and political prisoners. Under his command, entire towns and villages were obliterated. His scorched earth policy, implemented as Germany began losing the war, left vast swaths of Europe in ruins. Number 3. China's Mao Zedong often escapes the same level of infamy as Hitler and Stalin, yet his policies were responsible for some of the most egregious human rights violations in history. As the leader of the Communist Party of China, Mao was determined to transform China into a socialist utopia. But his methods led to unspeakable suffering and death. The most infamous of Mao's policies was the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962, a disastrous attempt to rapidly industrialize China and collectivize its agriculture. In reality, the Great Leap Forward resulted in one of the deadliest famines in human history. Mao's government set unrealistically high production quotas, confiscating grain from peasants. Fearing punishment, local officials exaggerated production figures, worsening food shortages. Over 45 million people died from starvation and forced labor. Mao's reign of terror didn't end with the famine. In 1966, he launched the Cultural Revolution, a mass campaign designed to purge the Communist Party of dissenters and solidify his grip on power. Youthful zealots known as Red Guards roamed the streets, attacking intellectuals, destroying cultural heritage, and denouncing counter-revolutionaries. Public humiliations, torture, and executions were common. Number 2. In the late 1970s, Pol Pot led Cambodia through one of the most terrifying periods of mass murder and genocide the world has ever seen. As the leader of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot sought to transform Cambodia into a radical communist agrarian society. The result was the systematic murder of nearly 2 million Cambodians, about a quarter of the population. Pol Pot's vision for Cambodia was based on a return to a mythical Year Zero, where all forms of modernity were wiped away. Intellectuals, professionals, and anyone associated with urban life were targeted for elimination. Cities emptied, people were forced into brutal labor camps, and starvation, disease, and executions were rampant. The regime's secret police, Santebal, carried out widespread purges. Anyone suspected of harboring counter-revolutionary thoughts, often based on the flimsiest evidence, was tortured and executed. The notorious Tosleng prison became a symbol of Pol Pot's barbarity, where thousands were tortured before being sent to the killing fields to be bludgeoned to death. Pol Pot's reign ended in 1979 when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia, and his brief reign is remembered as one of the most extreme and brutal genocides in history. So what's the most gruesome dictatorship? Before we tell you, like and subscribe for more spine-chilling content. Number 1. The Kim Dynasty of North Korea, founded by Kim Il-sung, has been one of the longest-running dictatorships in modern history. Kim's iron-fisted rule, from 1948 until his death in 1994, set the foundation for one of the most repressive regimes in the world, characterized by brutal purges, forced labor camps, and a population that remains trapped in fear and isolation to this day. Kim Il-sung's regime was built on the principles of Juche, a self-reliance ideology that masked the harsh realities of widespread repression and suffering. Under Kim, dissent was met with swift and brutal punishment. His government established a vast network of gulags, where political prisoners and their families were sent to live in conditions of extreme deprivation. Torture, starvation, forced labor, and executions were rampant. Entire families could be punished for the crimes of one individual, with children growing up in these camps, doomed to suffer for the alleged sins of their relatives. His son, Kim Jong-il, and now his grandson, Kim Jong-un, have continued his legacy of brutality. North Korea remains a nightmarish dystopia where the government maintains strict control over every aspect of life, and millions live under the constant threat of starvation, punishment, and death. The 5 dictators described above share a legacy of unrelenting cruelty and devastation. Their reigns serve as cautionary tales of what can happen when power is unchecked, and human lives are reduced to mere tools for political ambition.